Hi, Morali. My name is Brian McDonald, and so I'll be taking you through my portfolio for my independent study, focusing in virtual reality. So, the little bit about me, I talked a lot about my problem-solving capabilities and design thinking process, and that's really the two things that I feel during this semester in class as well as in my independent study, I was able to hone in on and develop throughout the semester. So, starting out, we did the digital me process. I found this project to be really interesting. I talked a lot about being able to understand the foundational elements of the internet and how, although it's only made up of zeros and ones, it kind of creates a larger picture. And I think that's really important for this class specifically because while we didn't necessarily focus on developing our skills in every single area, we were able to develop a small set of skills in a lot of different areas that kind of gave us a foundational knowledge of the smart cities and virtual reality and coding and things like that. So that's kind of what I took away from the Digital Me project. Then in the Art by Code, I found this project to actually be quite frustrating just because my brain, I don't think, is wired to really understand coding in the way that a lot of other people might be able to. And so this was a really interesting process just because I really do like to design, but putting design with coding was just like a frustrating process because it was never quite looking like what I imagined in my head. And I couldn't quite formulate a way to produce the code that would make what I was thinking about. And so during the instructional videos, I was kind of able to make my way through it just because following instructions is pretty easy. But then once we were asked to kind of go off on our own and do whatever we wanted, that's where I really kind of fell short. But I think it was a good learning moment just to kind of think about where your skills really thrive and where they might not. And it's okay to have weaknesses in some senses, but it's always important to kind of give everything a shot and think about the process that way. And then lastly, we did the algorithmic art project. And so these were my four avenues. This was a lot more fun for me just because it was a lot more carefree. There weren't any rules and it was just really easy to use. Every single platform was so interesting to play around with. And I found myself really just playing around with the tools more than actually kind of creating art and just seeing what happens with what. You can ask my housemate. I spent far too long playing around with these tools even after submitting the assignment, but I found it really interesting. And then moving into my independent studies, so I chose to focus in virtual reality. This is something that I've talked a lot about or learned a lot about kind of offhand through my interactive media studies major, but never actually had the chance to dive into it. And so this was really my chance to kind of take the leap into developing virtual reality. I talked through all the history of virtual reality within my portfolio, and then was obviously able to give the Gartner hype cycle. It was interesting because you can see the virtual reality is right here in the slope of enlightenment phase. And I think that's really kind of where we are right now on the verge of, is this kind of going to go down the video game path, or how can we develop virtual reality to solve real world problems and adapt it to our society? So moving into the inspiration, I really was trying to avoid taking the path of gaming. I really wanted to kind of dive deeper into what kinds of solutions I was seeing for virtual reality that were outside the mainstream media that I was consuming every day. And so I actually found a case study from Iowa State that focused on the utilization of virtual reality in the design thinking process. So as you can see here from these photos, you can build out different diagrams and different forms of whatever you're trying to test, and then actually build them into these like virtual reality experience rooms. So it's two walls on the floor, and then things are projected onto the walls on the floor. And the cool thing is they'll have different iterations of people coming in for the focus group to kind of give feedback on the types of things they're seeing. And so I found that to be really interesting and kind of wanted to dive deeper into that. And I actually found there's kind of a secondary portion to that in VR terror preparation. And so in this scenario, there was a USC research case study done on active shooter preparation. And so they actually utilized virtual reality to train professors and faculty to understand if there were ever to be that horrific incident to happen, they would be prepared in a way that's not just educational, but actually experience driven. So then I moved into kind of my execution and my project proposal. And so while I was researching a lot of different ways of terror preparation and things like that, I actually wanted to utilize VR just in a way of how I've done Illustrator and Photoshop in the past, where it's just playing around and building a fundamental and foundational level of understanding for virtual reality. And so Morali actually gave me insight into the Adobe Aero software. And so I kind of jumped into that. And I played around with some of their stock imaging. And so as you can see here, I had this computer and a jellyfish floating on the screen. So it looked like someone was watching a video of a jellyfish. And then the jellyfish actually flew out of the screen towards the audience. And so that kind of built for me an understanding of not only X and Y axis, but also Z axis, and kind of the understanding of spatial reasoning within virtual reality that I haven't been exposed to within the other types of design that I've had the pleasure of working on throughout my college career. So then I went through education, and I kind of wanted to build off of the stock images that were provided. And so I utilized this video on YouTube that taught you how to utilize your Illustrator and Photoshop skills, and then pull the layers out of those softwares and actually implement them into Adobe Aero. But then as I was kind of researching that, COVID-19 hit. And while I was going through all of this stuff with COVID, I really wanted to approach a new research element with virtual reality. And so I actually entered the education sector. As we were all transitioning to education online, I wanted to see if there were any case studies out there that were testing the virtual reality experience within any type of education. And what I found was actually a case study for elementary school students in which they utilized a Google virtual reality experience where they were able to take a field trip to a World War II museum and actually simulate flying and learning about the different historical events. So as you can see, this is the simulation, as well as the kids actually on the VR tools looking through it. It was a really interesting case study, but there aren't a lot of data kind of backing virtual reality at this point. There's a lot of limitations, such as accessibility to virtual reality technology, as well as the financial ability of not only the schools that would be implementing virtual reality, but also the students. They might not be able to afford that type of education, and to have virtual reality at home would be an interesting concept. But because of the COVID hit, I think we are going to start to tumble through technology a lot faster, specifically within education, because of this pandemic. And so then moving into my process, as I mentioned, I kind of wanted to dive deeper into utilizing Illustrator and Photoshop in my actual execution. And so because I was no longer able to attend Miami because of the pandemic, I recreated the sundial scene on my kitchen table. And so you're actually able to see and walk past the sundial and past the bench towards McCracken Hall. And that was just a really interesting element to bring to the project, I think. And finally, from the outcome of kind of my experience, I learned a lot. Mostly, I think I jumped into the idea of virtual reality and diving into Adobe Aero a little bit too early. I found myself kind of playing too much with the stock images and not enough linking my personal experience with design in Illustrator and Photoshop with the skills that I was developing in Aero. And I think because of that, and because of the additional research that I was doing on COVID and VR and education, I didn't quite spend enough time on my execution. However, I'm really, really proud of what I was able to accomplish for the Miami experience that I was able to build. I think it was applicable to kind of the experience that I wanted. It was a feeling of nostalgia and excitement. And I'm actually thinking about adding my graduation photo to it to send to my parents and some of my extended family, and then doing something for my little sister who's graduating from high school. So overall, I was really excited about the process that I was able to go through and the solutions that I was able to come up with. Overall, I think, my summary is here, but I think virtual reality, while it's in its enlightenment stage and it's going to progress, I think it's up to us to really recognize that there's so much potential for it. And it's not just one thing. It's not just the virtual reality headset. As you mentioned, Morali, being on Zoom calls for class is a type of virtual reality. And I think that we need to kind of break down the stereotype of it, and that virtual reality can be a helpful tool in both education accessibility, but also accessibility in virtually anything. literally virtually anything. Education in any type of the word, HR, preparation, any type of business or training process can utilize virtual reality, but we just need to begin to understand it a little bit more and break down and begin to make it more accessible. This is kind of the overview of the process that I went through. So starting with the stock imaging, moving over to Illustrator, and then understanding the educational fundamentals of it, as well as the active shooter kind of process of virtual reality, as well as my final execution of it. Peer learning, I looked a lot at Layla's portfolio, which I found to be so fascinating. And as I mentioned, I think the big obstacle that I had to overcome was being able to take the things that I already knew and apply them to virtual reality. And I think Layla did an incredible job doing this. She took her skills in photography as well as Photoshop and Illustrator, had a clear path of what she wanted to do, and just went for it. Whereas I wanted to learn so much about virtual reality before even trying to dive in. And when I did dive in, I didn't really have a clear set plan of what I wanted to accomplish. And so if I were to go through and do this all over again, I think I would do a little bit more of what Layla had done, where I recognized something that I was passionate about pursuing rather than just learning about virtual reality, because ultimately I think she probably took away a little bit more than I did, because she was able to tie together her passions with something she was learning about. These are my citations. They look beautiful. And then semester reflection. I think this whole class has been absolutely crazy. It has been a whirlwind, to say the least. I have not ever been in a class that I've learned so much in such a short amount of time. I can't thank you enough for the experience. Coming into this class, I really wasn't sure how I was going to feel. We were covering a lot of information at one time, and I felt like I might fall behind, but the class was such a community, and you did such a great job leading it. I never ever felt dumb asking questions. I never felt as though I was lost in a way that was wrong. It was just a really safe place to trial and error a bunch of situations in which I could learn from before getting into the real world and making those mistakes for real. I learned so much about myself. I think, as I've mentioned enough now, kind of jumping into virtual reality without a clear set plan was my huge mistake. And I think that I'm going to take that with me for whatever I do in the future, whether that be virtual reality or any type of problem solving. I'll be able to kind of look at it with a keen eye and recognize what I can bring to the table, what my strengths are in providing a solution that's more beneficial than anyone else could come up with, because it's unique to myself. Really, I think I cannot thank you enough for this incredible experience, and I hope that you are staying happy and healthy. Thanks.